Hi everyone. So now that the Diablo 4 beta is over, I thought that we could make a little class ranking, talking about the strengths and weaknesses of each of them, and trying to give a better picture for launch in June. The beta is all we got. I've blasted both of the beta weekends a lot. I've also played the game before already. So I'm already clocking like at least 200 plus hours in the game actually. And I think I have a pretty good understanding of what is going on, how the classes perform under various situations with various builds. In the betas now, I've actually played upwards of 20 builds or so. I've leveled each of the classes 2, 3 times, 4 times even. So I've made like 15 plus characters or something like that. So I've really tried a lot of things, and I've also been theory crafting the game already for months for all of the classes. So I made this overview here yesterday on stream actually. So I also had a bit of discussion and back and forth on some of these points. But in general, I think I've pretty much nailed the things the way they really are with a lot of these categories. So I see like other people linking me other like rankings and these kind of things. And in my opinion, they all focus way too much on this first part here. So I have these different categories, as you can see. And a lot of people just seem to talk about, you know, Druid really bad, Necro really OP. And yeah, I mean, this is basically what we have seen based on the first 25 levels in the game. But this is also a way too shallow like picture to paint about the game and about the classes in general, in my opinion. So I try to go into like some other categories. Obviously, this is very subjective, but I ranked it by fun. I ranked it by build diversity of what I will expect later on, especially like in the end game. Ease to play. This is also a category where, yeah, it's a bit tricky to rank really, but I think that in general, some classes are just easier than others. And then we have mobility and speed. This is pretty self-explanatory. The expected end game scaling potential. So this really goes into a bit of like, you know, a mystery area because we don't really know that much about it. But there's definitely some things that we can like figure out based on what we've seen as well. Then the group utility and the hardcore viability. So these are the categories, and I'm gonna talk through each of them in some of the details. I also have some of the notes here for each of those classes and why I put them, you know, with that ranking. And we have the typical tier list and ranking system with S being the best, and then A, B, C, D, and F being the worst. So let's start with the first category here, which is the early game progression. So a lot of you have probably seen those memes with the Druid being kind of weak and stuff like that, and that is actually true. So in general, Druids and also the Barbs felt like they were underperforming compared to the other 3 classes, especially the Necro. And I think that part of the reason why Druid felt so bad is also because it was kind of like a one-to-one comparison with the Necro, which was by far the best and Druid by far the worst. So on the second beta weekend, most people had already played the other classes, and then they only played those 2, and you saw this insane contrast. But in general, I felt like Druid was actually still fairly okay, at least with some of the builds I played. But it's definitely a difference compared to Sorg and Necro that just have really powerful baseline skills that just work, and you blast for the early game. But that being said, I don't think that this category in general really matters. Again, this is just like the early game progression. Everything will change after that. 1 to 25 is literally a drop in the ocean when it comes to like how much time you're gonna spend in this game, how much further progression you're gonna make later on. This is literally just a tutorial basically. So I don't really think this is such a huge concern. I would like Blizzard to like maybe balance it out a little bit better, so that maybe some of the Druid and Barb skills are just like scaling a bit better early on, and maybe put more power into the skills instead of the legendaries and these kind of things. So there are some tweaks they could do, but overall I felt it was okay if you did it properly. In fact, I actually did try a Act 1 speedrun with Druid, so I completed the entire campaign and also like a few side quests on the way. And that took me 1 hour and 2 minutes, including the first renown reward. So that was actually kind of cool. And the way this worked was just I dropped the difficulty to Adventurer. So I guess most people that actually started playing mostly did it on Veteran difficulty, and stuff actually does get easier on Adventurer. And your kill speed goes up, and it's just like way more smooth. So this is actually the way to go, I guess. That, yeah, you just give up this tiny bit of XP, and you just have like a smooth progression and smooth difficulty curve until your pace picks up later on and your power goes up. Let's get into the fun category. So personally, I guess it's not a secret at all. I had the most fun with Rogue, so that was expected. That was my main class that I chose like, 3 years ago when they revealed the class. And I was not disappointed at all. I really liked the class. So keep in mind, this is a very subjective ranking. But in general, I felt like, yeah, Rogue is like fast, agile, you have lots of tools. It's just really fun to play. Sorc also goes a bit in that direction because of all the combos you can do with enchantment slots, with different elements, with different skills. Seems like there's a lot of stuff you can do to combine and mix and match things. And I think it's gonna pop off even more once we get to the second enchantment slot later, once we get to uniques and more legendary powers. And Sorc will just have like, the largest variety in playstyles, I guess. And they all feel really cool and impactful. Then we had a Druid. So despite the Druid actually being relatively weak, I had a lot of fun with Druid. I felt the Druid is really well designed, both in the animations and in the combinations of skills you can do. There are a bunch of defensive tools that are all useful. There are a bunch of like, synergistic like late game skills that are useful. The ultimates seem like they do have some place at least. And you have like really like a variety of core skills and combinations you can do. So I felt it was really cool to just try out all these kind of things, try to make different combos. And then especially once you get some legendaries, you can also do these crazy things like, converting werewolf skill into an earth skill. And then you can suddenly synergize with other legendary aspects and more passives on the tree and all these kind of things. And I think this is really something that makes Druid what it is. This kind of like experimentation and combination of different abilities and tools. Then we had the Barb. I'm usually not much of a like Barb enjoyer, but I did have quite some fun with it, especially once you are becoming a bit more powerful. You do have these like really impactful abilities like Upheaval. It just feels good to use. If you have like a Whirlwind build that works, you can just, whirl through the enemies, everything dies. That's kind of cool. The bleed builds are my favorite on the Barb. They feel really amazing, especially with the Rupture and like this Iron Maelstrom stuff. So overall, yeah, really nice. I can't really complain. I don't like it as much as like the others here in the Rogue, for example, but there's definitely a reason to enjoy the Barb. And finally, we have the Necro. So Necro, I just felt like, yeah, it was too much carried by skeletons, at least in early game. And there's not really that much on the skill tree. The Necro skill tree is very small, especially if you leave out like minions, which most likely most builds will do later on. I think Skelly's probably going to be very good in early game and then really bad later. And you're probably going to just sacrifice them on most builds, unless you're playing like a dedicated like Skelly build basically. And then there's not really much else on the tree. So there are two curses, one of which is trash and the other one doesn't even work on bosses. And then you have like some corpse abilities, but yeah, if you don't really want to focus on corpse explosion as like a main damage ability or so, yeah, there's almost nothing you can put on your bar basically. Like I actually really struggle to fill my skill bar with 6 skills in some cases. And yeah, I'm not really sure how this will feel later on. And on top of this, they don't really have like any mobility skill whatsoever. And most of their core skills are also very straightforward. There's nothing really crazy with like positioning requirements and these kind of things. So I just felt like, yeah, Necros, yeah, they're very laid back and it's not really my playstyle. But again, keep in mind that this is a very subjective ranking here. Then comes the build diversity. So this is not just in the beta now, this is also what I expect we'll see later on. And I think that both Druid and Sorc are definitely the kings here. So I already talked about this, like these combos, these experimentations you can do with Druid. You can play like various core skills in various different flavors, and you can combine them with other skills. You can combine the defensive tools in different ways. So I think that Druid is probably going to be like the class with the overall like highest number of different builds and different play styles. And it's just like that versatile. And I mean, that kind of makes sense, I guess. This is what the Druid is all about. So this gets an S. And I believe that the Sorc is also going to be like very versatile, especially with the different combinations of enchantment slots. Because right now we only had one of them, but later on you're going to have 2 enchantment slots, and you can combine this with, various legendary powers, etc. to make potentially really crazy combos. So especially like from some of the freer crafting I've done, I believe that there is a lot of potential for Sorc to just get absolutely like insane combinations going and blow everything away. And also regularly shake up the meta, even mid-season or so, just by new builds being discovered. So I think that the big 5-head theory crafting class is the Sorc, because of those combinations of enchantment slots and other various tools that I have. Then we have the Rogue. I feel like Rogues are really versatile as well. They do have like less of these crazy combinations between skills and stuff, but they do have lots of different tools they can stick into each of their builds. So they have those 5 core skills, and they have kind of like their own distinct feel, and that's fine. Then there's some trap stuff you can do as well. So there's the Death Trap, Poison Trap, there's some synergies. So there's like a Trapper Rogue, basically. So these are like the main like 6 different playstyles, but then you can really like fine-tune it to your liking. There are lots of tools like the Stealth, the Smoke Bomb, there's the Ultimates, there's the different imbuements, and you can always like mix and match it with any of the core skills and really create your own style and just, you know, have like your own identity with the Rogue. So playing and making builds on Rogue felt like it was a lot more up to you to customize your playstyle compared to the other classes. I felt like on the Rogue, when making a build, you always had this like basic and core combination, and then you had like 4 skill slots that you can just fill with whatever you want, with a lot more variety than is possible on the other classes. So there's like extra utility tools and defensive tools and crowd controls and these kind of things just offer a lot more here. Then we have the Barb. I feel like Barb has like relatively like solid, distinct playstyles with the Whirlwind, Upheaval, Hoda, Bleed stuff. So there is definitely a lot of things going on there. There's also like the Berserking that didn't really feel like it was great in the beta so far, but I guess it's also gonna pop off later. You have like these weapon swap abilities. You have lots of like cool situational tools. But I feel like compared to the Rogue, most of these situational abilities will not really be as useful because the shouts are just universally great on Barb. They might need some tuning. I think that is overall too good. And some of those like tools like Steel Grasp or Ground Stomp and these kind of things are just not really like impactful enough to really make a difference. And then lastly, you have the Necro. I already talked about this a bit. Just too few skills. They have like a very small tree. And I felt like I was mostly investing into my main skill and then passives, and that was basically it. So I think that at least long term, Necros need at least one other curse, and then maybe one other like corpse skill or so, something that is not like a damage skill, so that they can actually make use of that resource in any situation basically, and not have you forced to use Corpse Explosion basically. So in general, I feel like Necro builds are going to be like very like locked in, very straightforward, and not really offering that much in terms of like, you know, the crazy combinations you can do like the other classes. Then we get to the ease of play. So in my opinion, there is definitely some easier to play classes and some harder to play classes. So starting with the Necro, I felt like Necro is just like the easy mode class of the game. Not just because it was powerful in the early game, so I guess this corresponds a bit to this. But you also see that this is opposite here from the Druid, for example. I just felt like Necro is, yeah, overall just very straightforward. Most of the core skills don't really have like any like real requirements with positioning, for example, with timing and these kind of things. We just click them, they work, you know, everything is just like pretty straightforward. And again, there's not really that many like crazy tools that you can fit into your build. It's going to be very laid back, especially if you rely on minions. They can kind of like, you know, tank for you, clear the stuff for you. And you just stand there in the back and do your Corpse Explosions and your core skills and you're fine. So I think that overall Necro is going to be the easiest class. Partly due to the lack of tools and partly to the minions. Then we have the Druid. So I felt like this one was also pretty straightforward. Most of the abilities are, you know, pretty easy to use. There's nothing really crazy with like timing or positioning going on in most cases. There are some of those cases like Pulverize, for example, where you try to stay at high health so that you get the overpowered procs. But I think this is not going to be such a big deal later. Or, you know, something like Boulder or so, where you have to like, you know, time it and position yourself properly. But this is also pretty niche. In most cases, you know, you have really tanky character because you have really strong defensive tools. You have decent AoE skills. It just works. So Druid just felt like, you know, nice and smooth. Outside of being a bit weak early on. Then we have the Barb. I felt like Barb is okay, so it's always melee, which is like the one thing that makes it hard. So you have to like play around enemy attacks. So there are, for example, certain trash monsters even that can stun you, knock you down, etc. So you need to dodge those attacks. In general, you take more damage than other classes. But once you have a few tools available, you have the shouts, you have some stuns, you have some damage. It's pretty straightforward. You click and stuff dies. You have whirlwind and these kind of things. So nothing really to complain about here. Then we have the Sorc. I felt like Sorc is definitely getting into territory where stuff gets very interesting. I did talk about the enchantment slots and the build diversity, and this is part of the reason why I gave Sorc a C. So Sorc is very strong in the early game, which makes it very easy to progress through the beta, but I think that later on, once we get to the later stages in the game with more enchantment slots, with the legendaries, etc., there will be a lot of builds that require, certain timing, certain combination of, pressing the right buttons in the right moment, playing around enemies in the right way and these kind of things to really be super effective. Like there's a lot of stuff with lucky hit effects, with, for example, ice shards enchant that only procs against frozen enemies. These kind of effects that make Sorc what it is. Or for example, the unstable currents ultimate, where when you play like a full lightning build, you have to have the right timing when to use it, and then you have to reset it. You have to play around crackling energy. So Sorc in general is like a much more sophisticated class than other classes. There's a lot more stuff going on, and you have to keep track of a lot more different tools that you have. So I think they are not really going to be that easy to maneuver later on. And lastly, we have the Rogue. I think this also comes as no surprise. This is like the fast, squishy, high DPS class of this game, and it gets a D and easy to play. Yeah, obviously when you have like a really powerful Rogue and you're one-shotting everything in the beta, it's pretty simple, but this is again not something I expect to stay that way. So Rogue is gonna be like, the demon hunter basically of Diablo 4, with like the really high skill ceiling, with really fast split moment decision making, and timing of your crowd controls, of your defensive tools. And this is how you will actually able to be effective and even stay alive later on, I imagine. Next, we have the mobility and speed ranking. So continuing with the Rogue, this one gets an S. I guess this is pretty obvious. You have lots of mobility, you have lots of speed. There are passives, there's Dark Shroud, there is Dash, Shadow Step, all this good stuff. So Rogue has by far the most tools available here. So it is gonna feel really fun and fast and smooth to play. And we also have the Barb. I think Barbs are going to be pretty solid as well once you start stacking up some of those buffs and you have high kill speed. You have extra movement speed on a tree just by default. You have the shouts that can also boost you. You have the leap that it can fit in. I think in general Barb's going to feel pretty good once you get rolling a bit. Then we have the Sorc, which has just one mobility skill, which is teleport, and not really much outside of that. But teleport is actually a very strong tool. Especially because it can go over walls, it can, break even CCs of that, and you can invest into it later with more cooldown reduction and more skill ranks into teleport to reduce the cooldown. So I think teleport is going to be just the tool for Sorc. It's going to be like included in literally every single Sorc build, and it's going to feel great to use. So I had a lot of fun with that, even when it was not really like fully ramped up yet. And yeah, if they don't fix widescreen stuff, which I believe they will, Sorc is going to be pretty crazy actually with the mobility. Then we have Druid. So Druid doesn't really have like any mobility really. There's like one skill which is Trample, which I actually did not include in any one of my builds on the Druid. I just felt like it was too long cooldown, not really that great, not really that fast. Yeah. So Druid is really weak on that department, but it does have some movement speed. It does have something like Shred, for example, as a werewolf. And it has to have like Wind Shear, for example, that can give you a 20% movement speed. So there are some tools available here, but it depends on the build. And we have the Necro, where you literally have nothing. So yeah, all you can do is walk. And you have Blood Mist that actually slows you down. And that's like literally the only movement skill. So yeah, Necros are really bad. I hope that long-term Necros gonna get something, like at least in an expansion or so when they start adding more skills or something like that. Maybe some kind of like corpse teleport could be cool or so. But yeah, let's see. Anyway, let's move on to the endgame potential. make sure that you take all of this with a huge grain of salt now, because, well, we only played up to level 25. And obviously, projecting this, 100, 200 hours ahead into the future in terms of gameplay and level 100 fully decked out is not really that possible. But there are already some of those effects that we can see based on what we have seen in beta and the data mining and all this stuff. So I'm gonna just try to lay it out the best way possible. So I think that barbs are gonna be absolutely ridiculous in endgame. Part of the reason is that they can start scaling up Fortify, which just gives them more and more damage reduction. They have Challenging Shout, which potentially right now has the potential to just make them perma-invincible, which I guess will be fixed, but at the very least it's probably going to be strong as a defensive tool. And they're also going to be like a very, very strong offensively. They have these 4 different weapons that just get more and more stats as you go to higher levels. And you have more and more tools available to put different legendary powers or uniques into those slots. So compared to the early game barbs that are kind of weak because they have nothing, they just get stronger and stronger as you get more tools that you can put into your build, as you get more stats on your items. So even at level 25, barbs were probably the strongest class in the game when they were fully geared up. So we saw these clips of like 350k crits on barb and these kind of things. No other class got even close to that. And I think that barbs are just gonna like hyper scale super hard in the late game once you have everything like super decked out, simply because they have these more item slots and they have more tools to move around and just gain more raw power. I do have to say that I believe this is a bit of a problem, and I think this progression curve should be more smoothed out, and it should not be like basically any other ARPG that has a Barbarian, where, it's really weak early on because you're squishy, you're melee, you have no damage, and then it's really good later on when you have like all the power, all the good weapons, and you're just like destroying everything. I feel like this, difference should be like shrunk a little bit, basically, so that it's like, just more solid overall without this like super crazy scaling later on. But this is up to Blizzard to change, and we'll see if they do anything about it. But either way, I expect barbs to be very powerful at max level. Then we have Sorcs. I think also Sorcs are gonna be pretty crazy. I did talk about this with the build diversity. I think that, every few days or so after launch, we're gonna get like some insane new Sorc build that just obliterates everything because of some crazy combination that people have found. So I feel that, with all the tools they have with the enchantment slots, so while Sorcs do not have this raw power that the barbs bring with just stats, they do have this combo potential and this kind of like hyper scaling, like, for example, through crit effects, through lucky hit effects and these kind of things, they can just like proc more and more different abilities and everything just goes crazy. So I expect that Sorcs will be super powerful in the endgame as well. Something similar also applies to the Druids. So I did talk about the build diversity and the combinations, and I also believe that once you have those tools available, we've also seen this in the beta already with Druids just going from like super terrible to really powerful, one-shotting with dungeon bosses and stuff like that, once you had a few of those legendary powers, and they did that with various builds. So I think that with even more combinations unlocking later, with the spirit runes unlocking later, that also was not available at all in this beta now, Druid's really gonna pop off. They're gonna be very straightforward to play. They're gonna be very tanky because they also have access to Fortify. They have great defensive tools, and you have, potential like insane damage as well from certain combos. I think Druids are gonna be really good later on. And then we have a B for Necro and Rogue. I'm not really sure how to judge the skeleton builds and like the minion builds in general on Necro. This could really be anything, but they will definitely fall off over time unless there's some, late game, like huge boosts to minion builds, because they only get like 30% of your stats. So this means that all these kind of like crit builds are not really going to work well for your minions, because crit builds usually rely on high crit chance plus high crit damage for this exponential damage scaling, and this just doesn't really work for the minions. So yeah, that's going to be probably like this kind of like one dedicated skeleton build, and then a bunch of other builds that are probably also really good, like based on the core skills, and maybe something like Bow and Spirit or Corpse Explosion even. So you can do that stuff, but they don't really have like these crazy tools available like other classes, in my opinion. And lastly, the rogue. I feel like rogues are going to be very good as well, especially for DPS. I think that they have like also really high crit scaling, for example. They have cooldown scaling with something like Twisting Blade and these kind of things. So there is definitely potential here, but rogues do not really have that many defensive tools. And I think that if the game turns out to be very difficult at a high end, at least when it comes to high nightmare dungeon pushing or stuff like that, I do expect that, yeah, you mostly gonna die very easily on a rogue, which is why I give it a B. If survivability is not really an issue, I would actually give them an S, because they're probably gonna be super fast, flying all over the map. So in terms of like farming potential, I guess they're really good. But when it comes to like difficult content, boss killing and all the stuff, I think they're going to be rather on the weaker end compared to some of the other classes. Let's get into the group utility. So first of all, I have to say that it is kind of questionable if you're actually going to see some kind of like support builds, support meta at all. I believe that, you know, there needs to be a real reason to play a support in Diablo 4, and right now we do not have any of that. I believe that probably at the very high end for Nightmare Dungeon pushing, there is a reason to play supports and potentially bring multiple supports to a party even. So we'll have to wait and see. But in general, this is not like Diablo 3, for example, where, you know, you load up a support character, you craft some gear in 5 minutes, and then you're ready to go for GR 150 with your ZDH or something like that. I think that supports in general require a lot of investment. They require a lot of fine-tuning to really be useful to a party. And we're only going to see them at the very high end for like very coordinated teams because of the investment that, you know, you have to make a dedicated character, level it to 100, and then switch it to a support build. And then you can only play it with other people. And then you have to make a second character that you can play on your own. So this is basically how it's going to go, I guess. And I don't really think that, yeah, we're gonna see much of supports, but we'll see, I guess. Outside of those dedicated support characters, you can also include a lot of different tools just to help out your party when you play together. And this is also like what I'm ranking here mostly. So I think that number one here is the Barb. Barb has the shouts, which are just overall really powerful with the resource generation, with the damage reduction, etc. So those are going to be like the kings here, like support barbs, you know, this is like D2 all over again with the shouts. Personally, I'm not really happy with that. I think that these group buffs in some cases should be tuned down a bit, because it might just lead to buffs becoming that kind of support role or kind of this required party member. So this definitely needs some looking at, but this is how it is. I think that buffs are going to be the best. And then we have the druids. They also have lots of party buffs. They can buff crit with Blood Howl, they can heal people, they can give damage reduction to everyone. They have tons of CC, vulnerable uptime, they can tank. Yeah, in general, druids just really solid for party play in my opinion. Then we have Sorc and Rogue, which are a little bit behind in my opinion. So they don't really bring that much like party buffs, but they bring a lot of utility, especially through vulnerable uptime, through crowd control, and potentially pulling, for example. You have a bit of damage reduction in some cases, like the poison stuff on the rogue. So there's definitely some tools available to these classes. And lastly, we have the Necro with, yeah, probably being the worst class here. So they have one really good tool, which is Decrepify, which slows and gives damage reduction. But yeah, outside of that, I feel they don't really bring much. So they can maybe pull enemies a little bit with Blight or Corpse Tendrils. But I think both these tools are just going to be like too clunky and too slow to really be useful. And yeah, the Decrepify doesn't even work on bosses. So I don't really expect much here from those Necros until we see more. And lastly, here's the hardcore ranking. So that depends a little bit on how hard the highest end content is actually going to be. I expect that at least like tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons are going to be like ridiculous in terms of difficulty. Probably, you know, maybe even unbeatable. So that, you know, this viability really comes into play. And also just in general, some of the classes are just more suited for hardcore than others in my opinion. So let's get into that. So I think number one is the Sorc, which, well, has one thing that I'm extremely unhappy about, which is the Flame Shield Cheat Death. So there's an enchantment where, well, you cannot die. So when you die, you proc this Cheat Death and then you survive, and this can proc once every 2 minutes. So this is going to be kind of like a no-brainer for Sorcs on hardcore, which is a massive problem in my opinion. That should not exist. This is the only class that has a G-Def, and we have seen G-Defs in Diablo 3, and it has ruined the entire game mode. So yeah, part feedback here, this needs to change. If it doesn't change, Sorcs are going to be like the hardcore class. You're ranged, you have a G-Def, there's nothing that can go wrong really. And you basically can never die. If they remove this G-Def, I'd say Sorc is probably going to be like an A still, probably. So I think Sorc's going to be pretty solid, but yeah, maybe a bit on the squishier side. So we'll see. Then we have the Barb and the Druid. So I gave them both an A because, well, they are tanky boys. You have Fortify, you have really good defensive tools, potentially perma invincibility on Barb, who knows. So if that is not fixed, so that sounds pretty good for hardcore. And just in general, I think like both these classes are not really going to have like any bad time on hardcore, at least once you get out of the early game and you start scaling up a little bit. And then we have Necro and Rogue that I both gave a C. In the case of Necro, yeah, they have Fortify as well, which is very nice, but that's about it. So I don't really expect Necros to be like really like popular choice on hardcore. But I guess they have these minions, you can make like minion builds and they tank stuff for you a little bit, and it's gonna be kind of fine. And you have lots of healing with those blood orbs, for example, potentially. And there are some tools available, but overall not really the craziest, I believe. And then we have Rogue. So yeah, Rogue is just like, you know, you have to rely on your ability to play the game to survive, I guess. So you need to time your smoke bombs or your dark shroud and your mobility. And, you know, this is how you survive. And if you do mistakes, you're going to die very easily. So this is my expectation. And with this, I conclude this ranking here. So this is what we got. Now we wait until release. There's no more betas. There's probably no patch notes. So we don't really know how it's going to be in the end. This is just a prediction based on the betas I've played, based on what I have seen them change in the past, based on some of my theory crafting and just my expectations in general with the game. So we have to wait and see how it will really turn out. I might be dead wrong on some of these points here, or Blizzard actually, you know, goes out of the way to make some sweeping adjustments to some of those classes, like, you know, the early game stuff here, or this invincibility stuff on, you know, Barb, for example. So we'll see what will happen. There's one other category that people kept asking me about to rank, and that was PvP, but I mean, really, what do you want to hear here? We didn't play PvP. PvP is like really probably like the wildest mode to play basically in this game. And this is an ARPG, so PvP is always like an afterthought. And on top of this, PvP also has the highest potential for like crazy builds popping up and the meta like constantly evolving over time. Because, you know, like certain builds become the meta and other builds come up to counter those builds. And then other builds come up to counter those builds. And then another one comes in these kind of things. And what you actually want to go for in PvP is really a big question mark. Like, are you just trying to one-shot everyone? Are you trying to just CC everyone to death? Are you trying to just outlast everyone and to have like an invincible character and it's like some attrition war? Who knows? So there's not really anything to say about PvP right now, in my opinion, and we have to wait for release. But either way, hope you enjoyed my ranking here. Let me know with what you agreed or disagreed on. I would be quite curious to hear more opinions. As I mentioned, I did this on stream, so I did have some talk about all of these things, and I did try to explain my reasoning for each of those rankings here. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it helps you maybe make your own decision for when the game launches, for deciding on a class. Again, you know, everything is kind of like up in the air. There might be a lot of updates. There might be, you know, a lot of crazy things discovered, exploits, bugs that, you know, just shake everything up anyway. So, as I said, just take this with a grain of salt. Hope you liked this video here, and I'll see you guys next time.